There is a man in history whose wealth was so enormous that when he entered Cairo, the value of gold itself reportedly fell. His name was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire. For centuries, stories about him have described unimaginable riches, caravans filled with gold, and an empire stretching across much of West Africa. But there is a problem with the famous story. We cannot calculate Mansa Musa's fortune in the same way we calculate the wealth of a modern billionaire. So was Mansa Musa really the richest person who ever lived? The answer is more complicated, and far more interesting. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire in West Africa during the 14th century, roughly from 1312 to 1337. Under his rule, Mali became one of the most powerful states in the region, controlling important territories and trade routes connected to gold, salt, and other valuable goods. But Mansa Musa did not become extraordinarily wealthy simply because he owned a giant pile of gold. His real advantage was something much bigger. He controlled a powerful economic system. Mali sat at the intersection of major trans-Saharan trade networks. Gold moved north, salt moved south. Merchants crossed enormous distances, and the empire benefited from controlling territory, trade routes, tribute, and access to valuable resources. And this is where Mansa Musa's story begins to change from the story of a rich king into the story of a ruler who understood power. Because gold was not valuable simply because it was beautiful. It was valuable because the wider world wanted it. The Mediterranean and Islamic economies had a huge demand for gold, while salt was essential for everyday life, and especially important across the Sahara. Mali was positioned between these worlds. That position generated enormous wealth. And Mansa Musa expanded that advantage. Under his reign, Mali's influence stretched from the Atlantic coast toward Gao and deep into the southern regions of the Niger River basin. He strengthened administration, collected tribute from subordinate rulers, and benefited from trade passing through his territory. But then came the journey that transformed his reputation forever. In 1324, Mansa Musa left Mali to perform the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. A pilgrimage was already a major undertaking. For a ruler traveling across the Sahara with an enormous royal entourage, it became something else entirely. When Mansa Musa reached Cairo, people encountered a West African ruler carrying an amount of gold that reportedly stunned them. Medieval accounts describe an entourage numbering in the tens of thousands and a caravan carrying huge quantities of gold. Some accounts give extraordinary figures for the amount carried by camels and members of the caravan, although these numbers should be treated cautiously because medieval sources often use dramatic descriptions. But one part of the story is especially important. Mansa Musa spent and distributed so much gold in Cairo that the local gold market was reportedly disrupted. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that his arrival carrying roughly a ton of gold was enough to cause a major fall in the value of gold, illustrating just how unusual the sudden supply was. Other historical accounts describe a decline of around 20% and a recovery that took years. Think about what that means. Today, if one billionaire suddenly released a huge amount of a commodity into a relatively small market, prices could move. But Mansa Musa was operating in a medieval economy. There were no modern central banks ready to stabilize markets, and no one expected a foreign ruler to arrive with such extraordinary quantities of gold and spend it so freely. His generosity became an economic event, but there was another consequence. People started talking. News of the mysterious ruler from West Africa traveled far beyond Cairo, and eventually, Mansa Musa appeared on European maps. The famous Catalan Atlas, created in the 14th century, depicts the ruler of Mali holding gold, presenting him as a symbol of the extraordinary wealth associated with his empire. Suddenly, Mali was no longer just a distant African empire. To outsiders, it became a place associated with gold. And Mansa Musa became its human symbol. But here is where the modern idea of his wealth can become misleading. Modern historians cannot reliably convert the resources and political power of a 14th century emperor into a modern dollar figure. In fact, Mansa Musa's real power may have been more impressive than a single number suggests. He controlled a state that sat on top of an economic network. That distinction matters. Across the Sahara, salt was not some luxury product. It was essential, and large quantities moved through long-distance trade networks. Gold flowed northward, while salt moved southward, creating an economic relationship that helped enrich the states controlling these routes. Then there was another product, cola nuts. These commodities, combined with tribute and taxation, helped create a powerful economic base. And Mansa Musa understood something that many rulers throughout history learned the hard way. But Mansa Musa was not simply an economic ruler. He was also a Muslim monarch, and his pilgrimage had consequences beyond wealth. After his journey, scholars, architects, and religious figures became associated with Mali's growing intellectual and architectural reputation. Timbuktu, in particular, would become famous as a center of scholarship and Islamic learning. So the journey that made Mansa Musa famous for gold also helped connect Mali more strongly with the wider Islamic world. And that may be one of the most overlooked parts of the story. Mansa Musa did not just export wealth. He exported an image of Mali, an image powerful enough to survive centuries. But there is an uncomfortable question. If Mansa Musa was so powerful, why didn't his empire remain at the same level forever? Because extraordinary wealth does not automatically create permanent stability. Mansa Musa eventually died, and Mali continued for generations, but political power became more complicated. Later rulers faced internal struggles, external pressures, and changing regional dynamics. The empire that had once dominated enormous territories eventually lost influence, while other powers rose in West Africa. And this brings us back to the original question. Was Mansa Musa actually the richest man in history? We cannot prove it with a modern number. There is no trustworthy balance sheet showing exactly how much personal wealth he possessed. But if the question is whether any ruler in history controlled an extraordinary concentration of natural resources and political power, Mansa Musa absolutely belongs among the most remarkable examples. And perhaps the most fascinating part is this. His wealth was not simply about having gold. It was about controlling a system that made gold move. That is why his story survived. A king became a legend. A pilgrimage became an economic shock. And one man's generosity became powerful enough to affect the value of one of the world's most valuable commodities. So when people call Mansa Musa the richest man who ever lived, the safest answer is not a gigantic dollar figure. It is something much more interesting. We don't know exactly how much he was worth, but we do know that, for a brief moment in the 14th century, the wealth flowing through one African empire was so extraordinary that the arrival of its ruler could shake a foreign economy. And that may be the real story behind the richest man in history. Not how much gold he had, but how much power he had over the world around him.